Right. So probably just take that one question before jumping into the session. So so the question was, how do you secure your JavaScript code for a Windows 8 store app? Whatever you deploy here. So when you build your app, obviously you're building it as HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and when you deploy it, it gets deployed as JavaScript, HTML, CSS. So it doesn't get transformed, nothing, right? So how can you secure your JavaScript code? You can't. Simple answer, right? So it's very similar to web applications in that respect. So folks can do view source and look at the source, right? So you can certainly pack your files, can minify it, run it through your standard build process that you probably use for web applications. But it's still script, right? It's still plain text that gets deployed. It's not very like regular users would probably not be able to get to your source. It's a hidden folder. There are permissions. You need to have admin privileges to look at it. Those standard things that you would expect are there. So, for example, if you go to SQL in program files, so there is a folder here called Windows Apps. So by default, you don't see it. So what you essentially have to do is, you have to run a console as admin, or at least this is how I do it. You have to go to SQL and program files. You have to go to Windows Apps. So this shows up only here if you know what you're looking for, and that's where all the apps get installed. And then you can look at the source. For example, let's say the Zomato app. Right, so you can see if you have good eyesight, you can see that it's HTML. Right. So you have your HTML images, JS, all of that is there. This is the deployed location, right? So so folks who know what they're doing can get to it. Not so tech savvy users probably wouldn't be able to get to it. But the point is, if you there are a couple of things, right? So as a security best practice, security by obscurity is never a good idea, right? So anytime you want to implement a piece of code which needs to be secure, and the secrecy of that depends on the secrecy of the algorithm, that's generally not a good security best practice, right? So for example, if you look at PKI, right, public key encryption. So there, the actual algorithm itself is a standard, it's an industry standard. So pretty much anybody can provide implementations of it. The strength of that security depends on the secrecy of the private key, right? So so that's an example of a good security system. So that's what you should be building, right? Having said that, there are a couple of things you can do. One is Windows Store applications can be hybrid applications. What do we mean by that? Your user interface can be HTML, JavaScript. Parts of your application can be written in C++, for example, right? So if you have some piece of code that you don't want to be as easily decompilable as perhaps JavaScript is, one option is you can build it in C++. Then it would be a native, it would be a native DLL that gets deployed with your app. Is it 100% foolproof? It's not, right? It's just a question of how determined you are. There are people who can disassemble your code, look at the assembly, and then still figure stuff out, right? So it's not. The security best practice still applies, but you can take it to some extent. So you can build your secret parts of your code in native code, and you can invoke it from here. In fact, probably in the last session, we'll see if we have time, we can take a look at an app which is hybrid, right, where the UI is in HTML, but parts of it are in C++.
So you allow native components to be accessible in JavaScript?
Absolutely. Right. The question is, do we allow native components to be invoked from JavaScript? Yes. In fact, if you look at it, you are calling the Windows runtime, the Windows System API, right? The Windows operating system itself is completely native code, and the case is no different. So you can write custom native components and invoke them from JavaScript. And in fact, the development team, Visual Studio, right? They have gone to incredible lengths to make it really, really simple and natural to access it from JavaScript. In fact, they go to the extent of doing funny things like just Visual Studio here. Close that. Oh. No, but something else happened. So I have Visual Studio here. So if you let's look at the documentation, right? So all the documentation is available in dev.windows.com. So let's say you want windows.media.capture. Okay, let's look at this namespace. I'm just picking one API, WinRT API, randomly. Can look at this class. So if you look at this here, there are a bunch of methods here, right? So get preview mirroring and whatnot, right? Initialize async and so forth. Now, if you look at it, there's one tab up here for JavaScript. So just go to that tab, and the documentation itself kind of changes. Okay, documentation doesn't change. But let's see, right? If you write a piece of code here, so let's look at one method here, right? Capture file async. Where is that API? Maybe I'm looking at the wrong one. Let's just go ahead and build an app and take a look. So this is not Visual C#. So I'll go ahead and select JavaScript, blank app. Alright, so imagine that we want to access the webcam or whatever. So I'll say function init. Probably make this font a little bigger. Alright. So your code would look like this, right? So var make cap equals new windows.media capture dot. Oh, it's camera capture UI is the name of the class. Alright. So if you look at this, I can say capture file async is the API here, right? The actual API is that, right? It's Pascal case, right? So they've gone to the extent of changing the name of the APIs to camel case, so that JavaScript folks feel. So that's kind of a convention in the industry, right? JavaScript libraries tend to be camel case. So all the WinRT APIs magically transform into camel case in here as well. It's not probably that impressive, but I was like surprised that they've gone to that level, right, to that extent. But yes, so you can definitely call native components. These are native components. So when I'm instantiating camera capture UI here, this is not a JavaScript component. This is a native component, but it's completely shielded from you, so you don't have to. I don't know if Visual covered this language projection piece. So that's the component that makes this possible, right? Where each API is exposed to that particular technology stack, that particular environment, in a fashion that is natural to that environment, right? For C++ folks, this would look and behave like a C++ component. .NET folks, this looks like a .NET component. For JavaScript, it works just as you would expect. All right, so so in this, that's strange. If I connect the power, my display goes off. All right, so we'll operate on battery. Okay, so this talk, we're just going to take a look at a few things, right? So one is when you build a Windows Store application using HTML JavaScript, how is your code structure, right? What are the key files that get generated in your project? How do you manage your code? How do you think about your app, right? Is it exactly like a web application, or is it a bit different? So the best way, at least how I think about it, is so folks here, have you heard of a way of developing web applications where you only have a single page apps? Like anybody who was not aware of single page web apps? So does anybody want to give an example of an app which is popular and a single page? Twitter. Yes, Twitter is certainly one. Gmail, right? That's probably so Gmail is kind of the classic example of an app which is just one page, right? So you can do you go to different parts of the app. You can compose screen, inbox, sent items, all those. But ultimately, there's only one page that's getting loaded from the server when you visit the site. Subsequently, everything is rendered dynamically from the client side, right? Windows 8 apps, if you want to think about it that way, they are single page apps, right? There is only one HTML page for your app. So when you create a project, no matter what template you use, you will find there is a default.html in the root of your solution, and that's the one page that gets loaded in your app, right? All subsequent navigations are all dynamically loaded within default HTML. So So I've just created a blank app. So if you look at it here, there's nothing here, right? So this is completely blank. Maybe what I'll do is I'll use a different template here. I'll use a grid app. Let's see what default HTML looks like for grid app. So it doesn't look a whole lot different from the blank app. The only thing is now we have a div here with an ID called content host. So other than that, this page doesn't have anything else, right? So it's a body and a div. So this is the structure for a page, right? The root. This is the container page. You can think of it that way. So there is the concept of a page. You can navigate from page A to page B, and you can come back and all of that. But what essentially happens is when you navigate to a page, that page basically gets dynamically loaded, and then it gets parsed, and a DOM element gets created, and that DOM element gets inserted into this container div. Right? That's pretty much it. And this really brings a lot of flexibility to the to some of the things that you can do, right? For instance, navigation. So so in Windows 8, people talk about it's fast and fluid, right? And the fluid part of it is not this fluid, but the fact that the animation, the transitions, all that, it's not an abrupt shift, right? So it's like not like one screen just disappears, another screen shows up. That's what we're used to. But here you will notice that everything happens in a smooth fashion, right? So if I navigate back, then something happens. So all of this we are able to do because of the fact that so basically you are able to load a DOM. Load a complete page inside the DOM dynamically, and then transition out the current page, and then append it to the DOM, and then transition that in, right? So you can imagine how that goes. So so that's what this kind of enables you to do. And the WinJS library. Yes, thanks. So I have to give t-shirts. So folks have questions, you get t-shirts, right?
You have question.
So that's exactly what happens here. So, and the WinJS library has a lot of utility animation functions where you can like if you want to get standard transitions, you can use any kind of transition that you want to use. So the IE10 platform supports CSS3 transitions, CSS3 animations, 2D transforms, 3D transforms, all of that. And then you can use that, right, if you want to use that. But there are a bunch of animations, and like for example, how the Windows operating system itself behaves, right? The switching between the desktop and the modern desktop and the app, right? So you can see there is a little transition there, right? So how do you launch apps? So there's a transition for that, right? So there are some standard kind of user experience animations that Windows implements by out of the box. So the WinJS library has a set of utility functions where you can implement those kind of animations in your app yourself, right? But you can do your custom animations if you want to. Yes.
Is there any kind of private apps like all are public apps, right? We publish it. Everybody can see it. Is there anything like a private apps?
Right. So the question is, whatever you publish in the store is visible for everyone. Can you publish private apps? Now, when you say private apps, so you have a specific market where you want to target.
When you search in the search bar, sometimes there might be the requirement like nobody should be able to.
I see. So a couple of things. One is it is possible to deploy an app to the store but not make it visible. So it will be a hidden app, right? And you as an app developer would have a link to it, and then you can distribute that link to whoever you want to. That is certainly possible. But another thing is probably what is probably more relevant is there are situations where people want to build an app, but it doesn't make sense to distribute that app through the store, right? So for example, a classic case in point is enterprises, right? So you want to build a modern Windows 8 leave management app, right? Now, the only people who would use that app is employees in your company, right? It doesn't make sense to put that in the store, right? Nobody's going to use that. So in these cases, there is a mechanism in the Windows operating system to sideload applications by your IT team. So there is a group policy that you can set in the system to enable sideloading. So by default, developer machines would have sideloading enabled. And the definition of developer machine is if you have installed developer tools, right? So if you put Visual Studio, then your machine gets enabled for sideloading. But other than that, even on end user machines, there is a group policy that you can set that your IT admin can push across your enterprise, and that enables sideloading for that organization, and your IT team can push apps in this kind of scenario. And there are other scenarios as well, like you might be an ISV, you might be an independent software vendor, you're not an enterprise, but still you don't want to distribute your app through the store. That scenario is supported as well. not, I don't quite recall the exact mechanics of it. I don't know if Ujjwal or Riju remember it. There's a blog post about this on the Windows Store blog. Probably I can look it up offline and share that with you. But that scenario is supported as well. Yes.
Okay, so my question is, just like in Android, right, when we build an app and all, so we publish the app.
Right.
And we publicly, I mean, based on your choices, whether you want to make it for an audience or not. So based on that, your choices, it will be public for all the users. Right? So how about this Windows app? Like for iOS, I built an app. I have to send them that app. They will test it with a platform and all those things. Right? And in contrast with Android, they won't do those mechanisms, right? As soon as you publish, within 1 hour it will be available, right?
Correct.
So what about?
So there are pros and cons for all the approaches. So for Windows 8 store, it's kind of like so given the fact that we have the benefit of looking at what Apple did, what Android did. So we have kind of a hybrid approach. So in the sense that it is similar to Apple, if you want to think about it that way. So you have to submit your app to the store, and there is a store certification process that happens. And there are specific scenarios where your app can get rejected. In fact, we are facing that on a daily basis with the customers that we're working with. But yes, so there is a certification process that happens. So it's not like you publish instantly it shows up. In fact, there is a timeline associated with that as well. If you go and log into your developer portal, it shows you a bunch of steps, right? So first there are some 3 steps. Probably I can show you what the thing looks like. So you can so if you go to log into your portal, it shows you the step that you're in. So there is like a technical evaluation, a bunch of automatic steps that happen, and then there is one step called content compliance, where a human would sit and look at your app and evaluate it and either certify it or not certify it. So there is a certification process that happens.
For every kind of app.
Every app.
You said you have adopted hybrid kind of stuff.
So we can take this offline.
Yeah.
Those questions are okay.
Okay.
To answer that, let's have more of JavaScript thing, which he has to talk about.
I think we have only 5 minutes left. Can you actually do something with that code and show something early?
Yeah, you know what? We can do that. So, in fact, we should do that. So, the last 4:30 to 5, we'll devote it completely for Q&A.
In fact, the next session also is coding.
Yeah. So, So we'll devote the 4:30 to 5 one completely for Q&A. I think we have lots of questions. So hang on to it.
It's good to have coding session.
Right. So have 5 minutes to code something.
Super fast coding. Build a complete application.
No, probably I'll just kind of walk you through the way how your app gets structured, right? So like I was saying earlier, right? So you have this single div which becomes the host for your app, as in all the pages get loaded there. But if you look at the solution structure, there is still a concept of a page, right? There's a folder called pages. Under that, a few pages have been created, and then you can add your own pages under this. Now, if you look at each subfolder here, for each page you have a CSS, a HTML, and a JavaScript, right? So that kind of defines one page. So essentially, what happens is if you want to navigate from page A to page B, then there's an API that you call. So, for instance, let's say from here, I think there should be a, there you go. That's the API call for making navigating from one page to another page, right? So from group detail page, when you click one of the items in that on that UI, it navigates from to WinJS navigate, and then you pass the relative path to the location where you want to go. So this is the API that you use to navigate from page A to page B, right? So what does this method do? It basically just dynamically loads that page, blows away all the content inside the content host, puts the new one inside that, and then renders that on the screen, right? So that's essentially what happens. If you want to know the details of how that works, if you look under JS in the root folder, there's a file called navigator.js. That's where all the navigation logic is implemented. So here, for every time you navigate, I'll probably not have time to kind of walk you through the entire process. But in case you want to implement things like implement a transition when you go from page A to page B, this is the place to do it. You get some transitions out of the box. So like right now I've done nothing. I've just created a new project and I just run it. So by default you get some transitions. So you can see that it's not just a simple flip, right? So when I go to one page, it kind of animates from the right to the left. So these are some stock animations that you get out of the box when you create the default template, and you can certainly customize this, right? So the place to customize that would be navigator.js. So there are specific event hookups there for as a page is about to load and after a page has loaded, and then you can basically intercept that and do your own animation if you want to do that. For example, Cocktail Flow, they do their own custom thing, right? I don't know if it's a JS app, but if it was a JS app, that's where they would have done it. So that's very briefly. That's how your code is structured, right? So when you go and add new pages, essentially what you do is you say add new item, and then you select a page control here, right? So when you say page control, then that's where. So let's say I want to go and add a new page here. So what I'll do is I'll create a new folder here. I'll say foobar, right? So a new folder, and then here I'll say add new item. I'll say page control, foobar page, and now you'll notice that under pages foobar we have the 3 files that have been generated, and then you can put your code here. So for instance, what I'll do is, so I'll say this is my foobar page, right? And let's say from let's go to default.html and let's put a button here. ID equals go to foobar, right? So let's see if that button shows up in the default page. Believe me, it is somewhere there. What I'll do is I'll get rid of this little bit of code here. In the next session, I'll tell you what I just removed. And we get an exception. Probably, since this is an existing template, there's a problem. Let's go back to our blank project. This is my blank project. I'll go here and do the same thing. I'll add a foobar page, add a page control, call it foobar, go to foobar HTML and put some custom content here, and then we'll go to default, add a button, go to foobar, right? And so obviously now when I run this application, you will just see one button sitting in the top left corner. And what I would do is, see, if you look at the coding patterns, right, it's very similar to how you do web development. So I'll go to my default.js. When the application is activated, I'll call my init function here, and in init, I'll say document.query selector. Select my button, go to foobar. I'll add event listener to the click. So I'll say go to foobar. So I've just added a click handler for my go to foobar button, and then here I can do something like this, right? So I can say winjs.navigation.navigate slash foobar.html, and hopefully it will go to that page. Probably not. Sorry.
It's time.
Oh, it's time. Okay.
You're taking away people's lunch time.
That's really bad. Okay, so I'm taking away time from your lunch, so let's not do that. So when we come back, we'll have 30 minutes to kind of cover this, and I also want to talk about controls. So come back, right? So
there are some t-shirts to give us. Like, we'll take 2 more minutes. I think we should give some t-shirts. So either you can ask question or let them ask question. 1 or 2 questions you can give.
2 questions. Let's take 2 questions.
I have a question. Support Raja?
Sorry?
Raja?
Yes, it is supported.
You can build dynamic.
Absolutely. So WinJS has a function called. So Riju's session, he'll be talking about XHR. WinJS.xhr is a function that you use to make Ajax calls.
Does it support a push kind of mechanism where I can actually push a news live to the user who has installed my app?
Right. Absolutely. Good question. So can you push information to the app?
You have a t-shirt? You already have.
So yes, you can. So there is something called as Windows Push Notification Service, where you can push information to the app from the cloud.
I saw that tiles are very possible to update. So when I install my app, Is there a customization like that available
Yes.
for me to
Yes.
update the type?
So you can update your tile. It's called as a live tile. You can change the content there, and you can push that content from the web as well.
So I think we should give t-shirts. You ask question. I think because we'll have. I don't want you guys to be. None of us want you to stay for long time.
Give to everyone.
No, everyone gets one by default.
One question.
You can set up a t-shirt shop. If you ask questions, you'll get more t-shirts.
So here, can we include like third-party libraries like jQuery?
Yes, we can. That's the short answer is yes. There is a caveat to that. Basically, it has to do with the fact that the sandbox implications are different from a web browser, right? So basically, it's a more permissive environment, and because of that, there are some additional security checks that happen, and you might run into issues because of that. Basically, as I was saying earlier in the morning, like anytime you add dynamic content to a DOM element, there are some additional security checks that are made. For example, in your markup, you have a script tag that's not going to get accepted. So right? There is a way to work around it. WinJS.utilities.set inner HTML unsafe. So if you know what you're doing, you can call that to override it. But as a general rule, it works as is. If you take care of these little caveats, and there are already applications out there that already do use jQuery. Get started. Exactly 24 minutes to go. So basically, there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about in this talk, right? So one is, how is your code structured? Where does your HTML go? Where does your CSS go? Where does the JS go? Another thing I wanted to kind of talk about was the support for data binding, and how does the UI framework work, right? So has anybody here worked with the JavaScript library called as Knockout.js? So we have one person. So this is, we have a couple of people. So the model for Windows 8 apps is kind of built on the same concepts as Knockout.js, right? So for instance, in this particular application, we were doing something here before we left, right? We'll give one shot at it and see if we can make this thing work. Maybe lunch would have made a difference. So there is one file that is needed here, the navigator.js file. So my speculation is that was the missing piece. Let's see if that fixes the problem. No, doesn't fix the problem. There's one particular template here called as a navigation app. I'm probably missing some wiring up somewhere. So by default, this is a blank application, nothing is there. So what we can do is the same thing. So add a to our page. And we'll add a handler for this button. So we have the go to Foobar button here, right? So we'll go to default.js and add a handler to that. So I'll do that here when the application is initialized. So query selector, go to Foobar, add event listener, on go to Foobar. So I'll go define that here. Here we'll say WinJS dot navigation dot navigate in pages /foobar dot html. Let's see if we have better luck this time. That's why we shouldn't build code stuff on stage. So that gives me a chance to show you that you can debug stuff. So like how you're probably used to debugging on Visual Studio or other platforms. So you can set up a breakpoint, you can hit F5, and then when the execution flow hits that location, it'll break, right? And you can do things like you can inspect objects. So for example, here the issue clearly is that query selector returns null, Probably I got my ID wrong. Yeah, the B is capital. So let's try that again. Let's see if we get a non-null value now. We do. So let's hit F5. And the button is not there. So that lets me show you another feature. So if you go to debug Windows, you can see there is a I don't know if you can see it, DOM Explorer. So this is very similar to the like in browsers debug tools, right? Chrome debugging tools, Firebug, IE debugging tools. So very similar to that, right? So you can basically see the DOM rendered here. So for example, you can click select element, you can go back to your app and you can select some element here. The blue box tells you which element you are hovering around, and when you tap that, it takes you to the corresponding element. And then on the right hand side, you can inspect. In fact, Ujjwal is doing a session about tools over Visual Studio and Blend, so we'll probably walk you through all this. So you can look at the styles, you can modify it, you can play around with it, all of that. So let's see what happened to our button. So that's our content post, and there's our button. Let's see trace styles. Trace styles tab shows you all the winning styles, right? So you have 50 different CSS styles. Which styles are actually finally getting applied on the button? That's what it shows you here. Not sure what's going on. Anybody have any bright ideas? One bright idea could be just give up and move on. You know what? That's what I'm gonna do because I don't have much time. But believe me, it works. So when you call WinJS navigate and provide a URL, it navigates to that page. Probably offline and take a look and see what I'm forgetting. So if you see the other app that we built, wait. So you see this control that is being displayed here, these boxes. So this is kind of a tile-based display, right? So this is basically a grouped tile display, right? So you can think of, it's a very common requirement in many applications. So you'll have a data source of some kind, right? So you'll have some data that you want presented on screen, and typically, it's some kind of a collection, right? So you have a collection of objects or something that you want to display on the screen. And if you wish to display it using a tile display like that, then you can use a control for that. So there is a control infrastructure available here, modeled on Knockout.js. So if you go to pages, grouped items page.html, see ultimately everything is a div. Okay, so if you see right here at the bottom, there is a div here. Now there are a couple of attributes of note here. One is data-win-control, and another is data-win-options. Right. So data- is basically a W3C spec now for tacking on custom attributes to DOM elements, right? If you want to put your own attributes and attach it to DOM elements, you can do that in markup declaratively. Then you can do that using this syntax. So you can basically put whatever attribute you want. For example, win-control is not a standard attribute, right? The only requirement is you have to prefix your custom attributes with data-. Then basically the browser will, this is applicable on the web as well, not just for Windows 8 apps. If you prefix the data-, then those attributes get exposed and are accessible through the DOM, right? So through script, when you say document dot blah, and then you get the element, and then you say get attribute, you can access this through the DOM. So there are a couple of controls, a couple of attributes that need to associate with your DOM elements, which cause that element to transform into that control, right? So there is a control called winjs.ui.listView. So once you give that string for this attribute, this otherwise lowly harmless div magically transforms into that tile-based layout, right? So even though that might seem like magic, it's not. And data-win-options is basically some some additional customization attributes that you want to customize that control with. So for example, in this list view, we want to say that selection mode is none, and the consequence of that is, when you tap on it, it doesn't get selected. So for example, if you see on the desktop, right, if I right click on it, you can select stuff, right? So you see the little checkbox that's coming. That's how you select items in a list view. And this attribute basically causes that selection to not work. And that makes sense there, right? So if I say, I think single, I think you'll be able to select it. So now you can see that I can select elements. You see that little checkbox that comes there, and all this is completely stylable, right? So this is a default behavior for checking. If you want to completely change and do a different thing for checking, you can do that. All is controlled through CSS. Everything, like so in the list view control, why is it showing those boxes in those dimensions? So basically, you define templates. So how many of you here have used things like handlebar or jQuery template, underscore templates, right? So all of these APIs, what they do is you provide some kind of a markup as a template, and then you have a little piece of script that binds that template with some kind of a data object, and then it just merges the two and renders the markup, right? It's the exact same concept here. So you have a div that you declare, and you associate a different control here. You say winjs.binding.template with this particular div, and then what you define inside this is basically the template, right? So how do you do data binding here? For example, for this image element, the src attribute needs to be set to some URL that's going to come from a data, right? So there is another attribute called data-win-bind where you can do that. So basically here you can see that src and alt have been bound to two different properties called as background image and title, right? So so this is the template piece, right? So far we have seen the list view control. There's a template, and then next we'll take a look at some script where we associate this list view control with that template, and then once you bind the data, everything is rendered, right? So that's conceptually that's all that happens. So if you look at grouped items.js, that's where that code resides. One more thing I think I forgot to mention with regard to pages is that so with regular web applications, right? If you're navigating from a page to another page, you have a page lifecycle, right? That you can hook into. Like when the page loads, you might want to handle the onload event and things like that. Right? Typically, you have page level initialization that you want to do when the page loads. Right? That's a very common requirement. Now, how do you do that in a situation like this where there is no page? Right? There is only one HTML that gets loaded. So how you handle that is so every page is it's basically you can think of it as a custom control, right? So basically there is a in WinJS, so winjs.ui. So this UI is simply an alias for winjs.ui. So winjs.ui.pages.define is a function that you can use to define custom pages, and it takes two parameters. One is the URL of the page that you're defining, and the second parameter is an object, right, where you can basically define your entire page. For example, these are all member methods that I have defined here. Navigate to group, and there are some special functions like this called ready, for instance. This thing gets invoked whenever the page is loaded, right? So this is the equivalent of your DOM content ready or whatever that you use on the web. So ready function gets invoked when you navigate to that page, and here is where the code resides for hooking up our list view control, right? So you can see the code here. So basically it says element.querySelector and passes the selector syntax for that particular element. In this case, it's a class name. If you look at that list view div here, it has grouped items list as the class name associated. So that's what we fetch here. And then it will have this one extra property. So querySelector will return the DOM element to access the winjs.ui.listView control, which is what we've specified here, right? To get a reference to that object, you basically access this expando property that gets tacked on to all these controls, right? So when you say .win control of anything, of a template, of a list view, and there are other controls, you get access to that control object itself. And then here you can see, how you hook up a template with a list view. So here you are basically saying that the item template use that div element. And what is that div element? That's the template that we defined, right? So this is where the hookup happens. So the list view control, we acquire a reference to it, associate the template which we defined here. This is the item template, which in turn is a binding template thing, and we associate that with the item template, and that's pretty much it. So this is the item template association. The same thing, the same concept applies for group header and all that. Like what you see over here, this group title that shows up. So that for how do you want the title to be rendered? So that is also a template. So that is basically a template called as header template, right? Yeah. So header template. So you would find a div defined for that also here. There it is. Header template, which is a winjs.binding template. And then eventually somewhere you should see a data binding happening. I think it's initial as layout. So here there is the code here for doing the data binding, right? So here we say that list view dot item data source is data dot items dot data source. Now what is that? That is basically my data, right? That's what is getting bound. So does so if you look at oops, didn't mean to do that. So if you look at your project, there will be a file called, so the default template, the data is basically all static data, right? So here it is. They just hard-coded all the data source. In a real application, this would get loaded from some server or some service, right? So so here they just hard-coded it, so we obviously don't want this. So basically when we say something like data.items.data source, right? So where is this coming from? So you know, one of the things that's difficult when we deal with JavaScript based applications is complexity, right? So once your application kind of functionality increases in scope, right? You have a big application, you have like 50 pages in your app. We're really talking about a lot of JavaScript code, right? So how do you manage this, right? If you're not disciplined about it, it can quickly go out of control. So WinJS provides some utility functions that allows you to kind of structure your code in a better fashion. So for instance, there is this concept of a namespace, right? So if you see this data.js, I think right at the top perhaps, there it is. So you know, essentially what happens here is there is a function that you can call winjs.namespace.define, and then you can give a namespace definition here, and then you define an object with a bunch of properties, right? So what happens is once you do this, wherever this data.js is included, you can access all these properties through that data object. So you can simply say data.items, data.groups, data. and so on, and you can do things like, you know, data.foo.bar. Then what happens is everywhere you can say data.foo.bar.items, right? So you can give syntax like that. So so that's what is happening here. In data.js, the items property is being assigned to grouped items, and you know, I would encourage you to kind of, you know, go through that flow and see where things are coming from. So grouped items is defined somewhere in this page. There it is. So that's where the grouped items list, basically that's my data source, that's getting initialized here. Somewhere this list will get populated also. There should be a loop or something here somewhere. There it is. So basically there's a function called generate sample data for each on each item, and then we push to that list, and the grouped items list is basically built on top of that, right? So if you see this list is simply a flat list of items, right? So let's say there are 50 items. It's just a list of 50 items, like an array. It's slightly fancier than an array. You will notice that we're using another control here, not control, another object here. I probably won't talk about that too much. I'm sure, I mean, things will probably get very confusing. I mean, we've already seen winjs.ui.listView, we've seen winjs.binding.template, now there is winjs.binding.list. But ultimately, you can think of it like an array, right? It's just a collection of items. Now, if you see the display, it's not just a flat collection of items, right? It's been categorized based on some groups. So the group title 1, group title 2, and so forth. So how does that grouping happen? So this list object has this nice method called create grouped, where you can provide a couple of callbacks to specify to that function how my items should be grouped, and that's completely up to your app, right? So you might have some criteria for determining how to group your data source, right? So that's what is happening here. So the idea is grouped items would refer, you would basically group your flat data source into, you know, you just categorize it into multiple groups, and that's what is being exposed from this namespace through items, and that's what is getting assigned here. So data items has a data source property which needs to get set to the list view control, and that's it, right? So and once you do this, when the control is rendered, it's going to do exactly that. It's going to take each item from your data source, apply the template on it, add that to the UI. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward stuff. So so that's the second thing I wanted to kind of show you. So what we have covered so far is, you know, how is your code structured. So basically, once you create a project, each page would have a HTML, a JavaScript, and a CSS, and you navigate between pages by calling WinJS navigation navigate. You you can. So there is this whole paradigm of a control, a data source, and a template that you can use to achieve various kinds of UI. Like it doesn't have, so the UI that you saw there, right? That's the default rendering, but you can customize it however you want. For example, Dhingana is a music app, and they do it in a certain way. So for example, here they have a list view. This is also a list view control, and they have rendered it like that, where basically these are the top songs, and then they have a data source here for different. They're grouping it based on featured albums, top playlists, top albums, right, and so on. So here you can see there's a different kind of a layout that they're using here, stuff like that. I would encourage you to kind of be creative with how you want to lay out your UI, right? I want to show another example. For example, Flight is an app from Flipkart, who are also here in this conference. So this app allows you to buy MP3s online. So that's the layout that they have gone with. This is a pretty nice app actually. It's a good looking app. This is not a this is the .NET app though, but you can draw inspiration from this. Another interesting thing that these guys do is they allow you to buy stuff from here. They have a concept of a wallet where you can recharge you can put money into it and buy MP3s. Good looking app. Another kind of good looking app here is CBazaar. So this kind of allows you to buy women's clothing if you want. And here they've used slightly different dimensions for their tiles, like that. Another app that I kind of was involved in was this Zoe app. This is also a different kind of app. You can click on that, it takes you to the men's section, and you see that. And they have a catalog screen which is rendered slightly differently. Like you can, it shows you all the dresses. You can tap on one. It shows you some additional images. You know what? Those are some of the things that we can improve on. You see how those images popped up like suddenly, kind of, there are things that you can improve on. It can be like Cocktail, right? It can slide in or something like that. Anyway, so you can select a size. You can say buy now, and they show a little flyout from the right, and you can say checkout, fill your address details, and place order. So, so Zoe is a pretty good looking app. So so this is a default template that we saw, right? So obviously you can customize it however you want. It's completely controlled through CSS. So that's pretty much it that I want to talk about in this session. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Feel free to shoot questions here. Yeah.
Can we have item templates or some other file?
So I guess your question is, can you define templates which you can share across pages? That's right. So how you would do that is, so default.html is the one page that gets loaded in your app, right? So that is one location where you can put your templates. Whatever you put in default HTML is accessible throughout your app, or whatever you include from default HTML is accessible throughout the app. So that's how we would do that. In fact, any common UI element, right? So for example, in many of these apps, they tend to have an app bar. Okay, this one doesn't have it. Okay, there you go. So the thing that you see in the bottom here, the filters, ready to ship, discount, and whatnot. So these are basically commands in your application, right? So for example, I might have a button there to navigate to my shopping cart. So you typically want to, in this app they don't have it, but imagine that you have a requirement where that button needs to show up throughout the application, right? So anytime you have a UI element that needs to be accessible and visible throughout the app, you would put that in default HTML.
One more question.
Yes.
The data-win control that you put in, can we do it dynamically, like creating an element and putting it, like, or do you parse it only on the first load? Or
Good question. So no, you can do it dynamically. So you saw that WinJS.ui.listView. So that thing is an object that you can create. So you can, the equivalent syntax would be something like, you say var something equals new WinJS.ui.listView, and then you pass a DOM element to that, and then it would use that DOM element to render the list view. So that you can do it through code. So declarative and imperative both. Yes.
What options do Windows apps have for storage
So the question was, what options do Windows apps have for storage? So there are quite a few options. So one is, if you're talking about HTML apps, one is, of course, you have the entire file system accessible to you, so you can put stuff there. You have web storage, so you have local storage, session storage, the HTML5 web storage APIs. They are persistent. At least local storage is persistent. You can use that. You can use IndexedDB. Then there are some WinJS has a API called as, I think, Session Manager. That is also a key value kind of interface, which is also persistent, and that kind of has support for suspend resume scenarios. Like if your app gets suspended and then you resume, then whatever you put in your session storage needs to get deserialized. Like when it gets suspended, it needs to get saved, and then when you resume it, it needs to get deserialized. So it has support for that. So that is another option. So there are plenty of things that you can do.
So like which of these storage options can sync across multiple devices a user can have?
Right. Again, great question. So basically there is a location, a folder location called as roaming, right? So basically when you are creating a file, let's say, right, you can choose to give a file path, a file system path, in which case it gets saved there, or you can give this virtual location called as roaming, right? So when whatever you write to the roaming location gets automatically synchronized across devices which are associated with that live ID, with that Microsoft account, automatically. Yeah. There are limitations around how much information you can put in the roaming folder. The idea is not to use that as a data storage location. The idea is to use that for as pointers to your actual data. So for example, right, your actual data might reside in the cloud, but you might put some information there in the roaming location that points you to that location, something like that. So for example, on Windows itself, right, which is kind of freaky, if you change your background on one machine, right, put a wallpaper, it just shows up in other machines, right? So that's kind of cool to see, but obviously it's not putting the entire wallpaper into the roaming folder. So all it does is it puts the wallpaper somewhere else, makes some reference to it in the roaming folder, and then picks it from the other machine and renders it. Alright, so I'll hand over to Riju now.